I stood there in that crowded conference room, watching my husband's face twist with embarrassment as his boss introduced me as the company's new CEO, the same woman he had just called worthless in front of all his colleagues not 5 minutes earlier. The silence was deafening, and I could feel every pair of eyes in that room shifting between us, waiting to see what would happen next. What they didn't know was that this moment had been 20 years in the making, built on secrets, sacrifices, and a strength I never knew I possessed until the day I decided I was done being invisible. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until that Tuesday morning in September, most people knew me as just another military wife, the quiet woman who stood behind her husband at company parties, who smiled politely when introduced, who always seemed to fade into the background while her husband commanded the room. What they didn't see were the years I spent serving my country, the battles I fought both overseas and at home, or the empire I was quietly building while everyone assumed I was just waiting around for my husband to come home from work. It all started to unravel during what should have been a routine company event. David, my husband of 15 years, worked as a senior project manager at Meridian Defense Solutions, one of the largest military contracting firms on the East Coast. I had been invited to their annual strategic planning meeting as a spouse guest, a title that always made my skin crawl, but I had learned to bite my tongue over the years. David loved these events because they made him feel important, surrounded by executives and decision-makers who hung on his every word about project timelines and budget allocations. I remember sitting in the back of that sterile conference room, watching David present his quarterly report with the kind of confidence that came from never having to prove himself the way I had. He wore his favorite navy suit, the one I had pressed for him that morning while he complained about having to drag me along to another boring work thing. His colleagues nodded approvingly as he clicked through PowerPoint slides, discussing weapon systems and defense contracts with the casual authority of someone who had never actually held a weapon in combat. The irony wasn't lost on me. While David talked about military strategy from behind a desk, I had spent 3 tours in Afghanistan as a logistics coordinator, managing supply chains that kept soldiers alive in active war zones. While he negotiated contracts in air-conditioned boardrooms, I had coordinated helicopter evacuations under enemy fire and rebuilt communication networks after IED attacks. But in rooms like this, I was just David's wife. And that was exactly how David liked it. The moment that changed everything started innocuously enough. During the coffee break, I found myself in a conversation with several of David's colleagues about supply chain disruptions affecting their current projects. It was a topic I knew intimately, not from reading reports or attending meetings, but from actually living it in places where a delayed shipment could mean the difference between life and death. I mentioned some innovative solutions I had implemented during my deployment in Kandahar, strategies that had reduced supply delays by 60% and saved the military millions in logistics costs. David appeared at my elbow just as I was explaining how we had rerouted critical supplies through alternative channels when traditional routes became compromised. His face was already flushed with that particular shade of red that I had learned to recognize over the years. The color he turned when he felt his authority was being challenged, especially by me. "Sarah, honey," he interrupted, his voice carrying that condescending tone he reserved for moments when he wanted to put me back in my place. "I don't think these gentlemen are interested in hearing about your little adventures overseas. Why don't you go freshen up your coffee while the adults talk business?" The words hit me like a physical blow, but it was the laughter that followed that really cut deep. Not malicious laughter, but the kind of uncomfortable chuckling men do when they witness another man diminishing his wife in public. It was the sound of complicity, of a system that had been working exactly as designed for so long that nobody even questioned it anymore. But I stayed rooted to the spot, my hands clenched, around my coffee cup so tightly I was surprised it didn't shatter. One of the executives, a silver-haired man named Robert Chen, cleared his throat uncomfortably and tried to steer the conversation back to my suggestions. Actually, what Sarah was describing sounds exactly like the kind of innovation we need. Those supply chain optimizations could revolutionize our current operations. That's when David really lost it. His voice rose just enough to carry across the room, drawing attention from other clusters of conversation. Look, I appreciate everyone being polite to my wife, but let's be realistic here. Sarah's been out of the workforce for years now. She doesn't understand the complexities of modern defense contracting. What she did over there was basically just filing paperwork and making supply lists. It's not the same as real strategic planning. The room went quiet in that awful way that happens when someone crosses a line they can't uncross. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but it wasn't embarrassment. It was rage. Pure, crystalline rage that had been building for years, fed by every dismissive comment, every interrupted sentence, every time I had made myself smaller so that David could feel bigger. Filing paperwork? I repeated, my voice deadly calm. Is that what you think I was doing when I coordinated the evacuation of 200 soldiers from a forward operating base under mortar fire? When I rebuilt the entire logistics network for the southern province after insurgents destroyed every major supply route? When I testified before Congress about military waste and inefficiency? David's face went from red to pale in seconds. He had always been careful to never let his professional life intersect too closely with the details of my service. In his version of our story, my military career was something quaint and temporary, a brief detour before I settled into my proper role as his supporting wife. The idea that I might have accomplished things he couldn't even comprehend, that I might have expertise that exceeded his own, was not part of the narrative he had constructed for our marriage. "Sarah, please," he said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a soothing whisper, but came across as pure condescension. "You're embarrassing yourself. These men have real jobs, real responsibilities. You can't just pretend that what you did in the military makes you qualified to understand corporate strategy." That's when he said it. The words that would echo in that conference room and in my memory for years to come. My wife has always had a tendency to exaggerate her importance. The truth is, she's been pretty much worthless since she got out of the service. She can't even manage our household properly, let alone contribute anything meaningful to a conversation about defense contracting. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the ventilation system humming, the distant sound of traffic outside, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Every person in that room was staring at us now, and I could see the mixture of shock, discomfort, and secondhand embarrassment on their faces. Some looked at David with disgust, others looked at me with pity. But what struck me most was how unsurprised they seemed. As if they had witnessed scenes like this before. As if this was just another Tuesday in the corporate world where successful men casually destroyed their wives in public. But what David didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the last 5 years building something while he thought I was worthless. While he was at work, dismissing my opinions and treating me like an accessory to his success, I had been quietly revolutionizing military logistics through a consulting firm I had started from our kitchen table. While he was presenting his quarterly reports about projects worth millions, I was closing deals worth hundreds of millions, contracts that would reshape how the entire defense industry approached supply chain management. I had clients in the Pentagon who called me personally when their systems failed. I had defense contractors across 3 continents implementing strategies I had developed. I had been featured on the cover of Defense Logistics Quarterly as the strategic mind reshaping modern military supply chains. But David had never bothered to ask what I did during my long days at home. As I stood there in that conference room, surrounded by men who had just watched my husband publicly humiliate me, I made a decision that would change everything. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a folder I had been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment to surprise David with news that I thought would make him proud. Instead, I was about to use it to destroy the careful fiction he had built around our marriage. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence like a blade, I think there's been a misunderstanding about who I am and what I do. I opened the folder and began laying documents on the conference table. Contracts bearing the seals of the Department of Defense, letters of commendation from 4-star generals, testimonials from Fortune 500 companies whose logistics I had revolutionized. David is absolutely right that I haven't been contributing to corporate strategy discussions, I continued, watching as the executives began picking up the documents, their eyes widening as they realized what they were reading. That's because I've been too busy running the consulting firm that your biggest competitors have been trying to poach for the last 2 years. The room was spinning now, or maybe that was just my head. 20 years of marriage, 15 years of making myself smaller, 5 years of building something extraordinary in secret, and it was all coming to a head in this sterile conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and broken dreams. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Because what happened next would prove that sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one who has been quietly planning your downfall all along. The first document Robert Chen picked up was a letter from General Patricia Williams, thanking me for my work on Operation Supply Bridge, a classified logistics operation that had saved over 300 lives during a particularly brutal winter in Afghanistan. The second was a contract worth $47 million with Blackwater Industries signed just 3 weeks ago. The third was a photograph of me standing next to the Secretary of Defense at a private ceremony where I had received the Defense Distinguished Service Medal for my contributions to military logistics innovation. I watched David's face as the truth began to sink in. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and for the first time in our marriage, he was completely speechless. The other executives were passing documents around the table now, their whispered conversations, growing louder as they realized the magnitude of what they were seeing. "Sarah," David finally managed to croak, "what is all this?" "This," I said, pulling out my business card and placing it on the table, "is Mitchell Strategic Solutions, the consulting firm I've been running for the past 5 years while you thought I was sitting at home being worthless." The card was simple but elegant, with my military credentials listed beneath my name. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, U.S. Army, retired, Defense Logistics Specialist. The transformation in the room was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, the same men, who had been looking at me with pity or dismissal, were studying me with new eyes. Robert Chen stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Colonel Mitchell," he said, his voice filled with a respect that hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. "I had no idea. Your reputation in the defense community is legendary." I nodded politely, but my attention was focused on David, who looked like he was having some kind of breakdown. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, and I could see him struggling to process how his worthless wife had become someone these powerful men were treating with reverence. "Perhaps," I continued, "we should discuss why I'm really here today. You see, gentlemen, I wasn't invited to this meeting as a spouse guest. I was invited as a potential business partner." I pulled out the final document from my folder, a formal proposal that had been delivered to Meridian Defense Solutions Board of Directors 2 weeks ago. "My firm has been retained by your board to conduct a comprehensive audit of your current logistics operations and recommend strategic improvements." The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went through several shades of red before settling on a sickly green. He grabbed the proposal from the table and scanned it frantically, his eyes growing wider with each line he read. "This can't be real," he whispered. "You can't have been doing all this behind my back." "Behind your back?" I laughed, and there was no humor in it. "David, I tried to tell you about my work dozens of times. Every time I brought up a project or a client, you changed the subject or told me to focus on more important things, like getting dinner ready or organizing your sock drawer. You made it clear that you weren't interested in anything I had to say about my professional life." Robert Chen was studying the proposal now, his expression growing more impressed by the moment. "Colonel Mitchell, this is extraordinary work. Your analysis of our supply chain vulnerabilities is more comprehensive than anything our internal team has produced in years. How did you gather this level of detail without access to our systems? I smiled grimly. 20 years of military experience teaches you how to gather intelligence, Mr. Chen. Plus, your internal team includes several former military personnel who have been quietly feeding me information for months. They're frustrated by the inefficiencies in your current system and the management's resistance to change. David was frantically flipping through pages now, his hands shaking. Sarah, I don't understand. When did you have time to do all this? You're always home when I get back from work. I work from 5 in the morning until you wake up, I said, simply. I work during your lunch breaks when you're too busy to call. I work after you go to bed. I work on weekends when you're playing golf or watching football. I've been building a business empire while you've been building… What exactly? A reputation as a middle manager who can't recognize talent when it's sleeping next to him every night? The cruelty in my words was intentional. For 15 years, David had chipped away at my confidence with small cuts and casual dismissals. He had made me feel invisible, unimportant, like a supporting character in his mediocre story. Now it was his turn to feel small. One of the other executives, a woman named Janet Reeves, who I recognized as the VP of Strategic Operations, leaned forward. Colonel Mitchell, I have to ask, why didn't you approach us directly? Why go through the board? Because, I said, glancing at David, I knew that if I came through normal channels, my husband's colleagues would see me as David's wife first and a professional second. I needed to establish my credibility independently before revealing my connection to your organization. Janet nodded slowly. And the board's response to your proposal? I pulled out my phone and showed them an email that had arrived just that morning. They've accepted my recommendations in full. They're implementing a complete restructuring of the logistics division, and they've offered me a 5-year contract worth $230 million to oversee the transition. The number hit the room like a physical force. David's quarterly budget was maybe $8 million, and he was proud of that. His wife, his worthless, unemployed wife, had just secured a contract worth more than his entire department's annual revenue. $230 million? David's voice was barely a whisper. Plus, performance bonuses, I added casually. The board estimates that my recommendations will save the company over $500 million in the first 3 years alone. Robert. Chen was on his feet now, extending his hand toward me. Colonel Mitchell, it would be an honor to work with you. Your reputation precedes you, and after seeing your proposal, I understand why the board was so eager to bring you on board. As I shook his hand, I caught sight of David's expression. He looked like a man who had just discovered that his entire life was built on a foundation of lies. The woman he had married, the woman he had been condescending to for 15 years, wasn't just his equal. She was operating on a level he couldn't even comprehend. There's one more thing, I said, and the room fell silent again. The board has also decided that the current management structure in the logistics division needs to be restructured. They're looking for someone with actual field experience to lead the department, someone who understands the practical realities of military logistics rather than just the theoretical aspects. David's face was gray now. What are you saying? I'm saying that they've offered me the position of Executive Director of Logistics Operations, effective immediately. It's a promotion that comes with a corner office, a substantial salary increase, and direct oversight of all logistics-related personnel. I paused, letting the implications sink in, including project managers who have been underperforming in their current roles. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. David was staring at me like he was seeing a stranger, which, in many ways, he was. The woman he had married 20 years ago, the young military officer who had been willing to sacrifice her own ambitions for his comfort, was gone. In her place stood someone he had never bothered to truly know. Your husband, Robert Chen said carefully, will be reporting to you, If he chooses to stay with the company, I replied. The board has made it clear that all personnel decisions in the logistics division are now mine to make. I'll be evaluating each team member based on their performance, their attitude, and their ability to work collaboratively with diverse leadership. Janet Reeves was trying to hide a smile. That's quite a change in the company's power structure. Change is inevitable in any organization that wants to survive, I said. The question is whether people adapt to that change or get left behind. Buy it. David finally found his voice. Sarah, we need to talk. Privately. I'm afraid that's not possible right now, I said, checking my watch. I have a meeting with the board in 20 minutes to discuss the implementation timeline, but don't worry. We'll have plenty of time to talk at home tonight, assuming you're ready to have an actual conversation rather than just dismissing everything I say. The meeting was breaking up now, with executives approaching me to introduce themselves properly and discuss various aspects of the logistics overhaul. David stood frozen in the corner, watching his colleagues treat his wife with the kind of respect and deference they had never shown him. Robert Chen approached me one final time before leaving. Colonel Mitchell, I have to ask, how long have you been planning this? I considered the question carefully. Planning what, exactly? Building a successful business? That wasn't planned. It was necessary. My husband made it clear that he didn't value my contributions to our household or our marriage, so I found other places where my skills were appreciated. And the timing of revealing your connection to our company? That wasn't planned either, I admitted. I had actually hoped to surprise David with the news in private, to show him that I was more than the worthless housewife he thought he had. Married. But after what happened here today, after he humiliated me in front of all of you, I realized that some surprises are better delivered in public. Robert nodded slowly. Your husband seems to be having difficulty processing all of this. I glanced over at David, who was still standing in the corner, staring at the documents scattered across the conference table. David has spent our entire marriage believing that success was something that happened to him, not something that required recognizing and nurturing the talents of the people around him. Today, he's learning that while he was focused on managing his image, I was focused on building something real. As the executives filed out of the room, leaving David and me alone, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. This wasn't how I had imagined my marriage would end, but it also wasn't the beginning I had expected. It was something else, entirely. A reckoning that had been 20 years in the making. David slowly walked over to where I was packing up my documents. Sarah, he said quietly, I don't know what to say. That's the problem, I replied without looking up. You never did. The drive home that evening was the longest 43 minutes of my life. David sat in the passenger seat of my car, a detail that would have seemed insignificant that morning, but now felt loaded with symbolism. He had always insisted on driving, claimed it was the man's job to be behind the wheel. But after the bombshell I had dropped at his office, he seemed incapable of doing anything except staring out the window in stunned silence. I had left the Meridian building 3 hours after our confrontation, following a series of meetings that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of both our careers. The board had been waiting for me in the executive conference room on the 32nd floor, a space I had never seen before, despite attending dozens of David's company events over the years. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was finally being invited into the inner sanctum, not as someone's wife, but as someone who commanded respect in her own right. The boardroom was everything you would expect from a defense contracting giant. Polished mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, portraits of distinguished military leaders lining the walls. But what struck me most were the faces around that table. These weren't the glad-handing middle managers from David's department. These were serious people who had built careers on making decisions that affected national security. People who understood the difference between playing at importance and actually wielding it. Margaret Thornton, the CEO, had greeted me with a firm handshake and an appraising look that I recognized from my military days. She was evaluating me, not as a woman in her husband's shadow, but as a potential asset to her organization. "Colonel Mitchell," she had said, "your reputation precedes you. We've been following your work for some time." Following my work. The phrase had hit me like electricity. While David was coming home every night, complaining about his difficult projects and demanding my attention for his problems, the leadership of his own company had been quietly monitoring my professional activities. They knew about the Pentagon contracts, the innovations I had developed, the testimonials from generals who had implemented my strategies in active combat zones. The meeting had lasted 2 hours, and by the end, I had signed a contract that would make me one of the highest-paid executives in the company's history. More than that, I had been given authority that David could never have dreamed of achieving. The board wanted me to restructure not just the logistics division, but the entire supply chain operation across all of Meridian's government contracts. "We've been hemorrhaging money on inefficient processes for years," Margaret had explained. "Our shareholders are getting restless, and frankly, our current management team has been resistant to the kind of changes we need to stay competitive. Your proposal offers solutions we hadn't even considered." The conversation had turned to personnel decisions, and that's when things had gotten truly uncomfortable. Janet Reeves had pulled up David's employment file, and the picture it painted was not flattering. Mediocre performance reviews, missed deadlines, complaints from subordinates about his management style. Most damaging of all were the notes from his supervisors about his resistance to new ideas and his tendency to dismiss input from team members. "Your husband," Margaret had said carefully, "has been underperforming for several years. We've been considering whether to move him to a different role or—" She had left the sentence hanging, but the implication was clear. I had found myself in the surreal position of potentially determining my own husband's professional fate. The woman he had called worthless that morning was now deciding whether he would keep his job. The poetic justice was almost overwhelming, but it also felt hollow. This wasn't how I had wanted things to unfold. "I'd like to handle the personnel transitions personally," I had told them. "Give me 30 days to evaluate each team member individually. Some people perform poorly because they're in the wrong environment, not because they lack capability." Margaret had nodded approvingly. "Spoken like someone who understands leadership. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need." Now, sitting in traffic with my shell-shocked husband, I wondered if I had made the right choice. Part of me wanted to protect David, to find a way for him to save face and maintain his dignity. But another part of me, the part that had been systematically diminished for 15 years, wanted him to experience what it felt like to be powerless, to have someone else control his professional destiny. "Sarah," David finally spoke as we pulled into our driveway. "We need to talk about what happened today." "Yes," I agreed, turning off the engine. "We do." Our house looked the same as it had that morning when we left for David's meeting, but everything felt different. The colonial-style home in our suburban neighborhood had always been David's pride and joy. He loved pointing out the manicured lawn, the 2-car garage, the swimming pool that he had insisted we install even though neither of us used it much. It was his symbol of success, proof that he had made it in the American middle class. But as we walked through the front door, I saw it through new eyes. This wasn't David's achievement. It was ours. The down payment had come from my military savings. The mortgage payments were made possible by my consulting income, though David had never bothered to ask where the extra money was coming from. He had assumed that my little side projects were bringing in maybe a few $100s a month, enough to cover groceries and household expenses. The living room where we settled that evening had been the site of countless arguments over the years, most of them following the same pattern. David would come home frustrated about something at work. I would try to offer advice or support, and he would dismiss my input as irrelevant. "You don't understand the corporate world," he would say. "It's different from the military. Things are more complicated. Now he sat on the edge of our leather sofa, his head in his hands, while I poured myself a glass of wine and tried to figure out where to begin. How do you explain to someone that you've been living a double life for 5 years? How do you tell your husband that while he was patronizing you about the real world, you were quietly conquering it? I need you to help me understand, David said finally. When did all this start? When did you become this person? This person? I set down my wine glass and looked at him directly. David, I've always been this person. The problem is that you never bothered to find out who I actually am. That's not fair, he protested. I know you. I've been married to you for 15 years. You know Sarah, the army wife. I corrected him. Sarah, the supportive spouse who makes sure your uniforms are pressed and your social calendar is organized. But you never knew Sarah, the strategist, or Sarah, the businesswoman, or Sarah, the problem solver. Every time I tried to show you those parts of myself, you shut me down. David was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him trying to process what I was saying. But why didn't you tell me about the consulting business? Why did you keep it secret? The question revealed so much about how little he understood our dynamic. I didn't keep it secret, David. I tried to share it with you dozens of times. Do you remember 3 years ago when I told you I was working on a project for a defense contractor? You told me it sounded cute, and then spent the next hour complaining about your own work problems. Do you remember last Christmas when I mentioned that I had been invited to speak at a logistics conference? You said it was probably just a feel-good diversity thing and changed the subject. His face flushed with embarrassment, and I could see recognition dawning in his eyes. I didn't realize. You didn't realize because you didn't want to realize, I continued. It was easier for you to believe that I was just your supportive wife, content to live in your shadow, than to acknowledge that I might have my own ambitions and achievements. But $200 million, Sarah. How did you build something that big without me noticing? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to know how? I'll tell you exactly how. I got up at 4:30 every morning while you were sleeping and worked until you woke up. I took client calls during my grocery shopping trips. I attended video conferences from our home office while you thought I was organizing closets. I traveled to client sites on days when you were playing golf, telling you I was visiting my sister. David's eyes widened. Your sister visits? Those were business trips? Every single one. I've been to the Pentagon 14 times in the past 2 years. I've consulted with military bases in Japan, Germany, and South Korea. I've briefed 4-star generals and advised Fortune 500 CEOs. And every time I came home, you asked me how my little vacation went. The weight of his obliviousness was settling on him now, and I could see him struggling with the implications. Why didn't you just tell me directly? Why didn't you sit me down and explain what you were doing? Because you made it clear that you weren't interested in listening, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Every time I tried to talk about my work, you either dismissed it or turned the conversation back to yourself. You trained me to stop sharing, David. You taught me that my thoughts and experiences weren't worth your time. That's not what I meant to do, he said quietly. But it's what you did. And after years of being told that my opinions didn't matter, that my experience wasn't relevant, that my ideas weren't worth considering, I stopped trying to include you in my professional life. I found other people who valued what I had to offer. The silence stretched between us, filled with 15 years of missed connections and willful blindness. David was staring at his hands, and I could see him trying to reconcile his image of our marriage with the reality I was describing. What happens now? He asked finally. It was the question I had been dreading, because the honest answer was that I didn't know. This morning we had been husband and wife, living parallel lives that occasionally intersected around shared meals and social obligations. Tonight, I was his boss, holding his professional future in my hands. And he was the man who had publicly humiliated me in front of colleagues who now reported to me. "That depends on you," I said. "The board has given me complete authority over the logistics division. I can restructure teams, reassign personnel, or terminate employees who aren't meeting performance standards. Your job isn't guaranteed just because you're married to me." The color drained from his face. "You would fire me?" "I would fire anyone who wasn't contributing to the team's success," I replied. "But David, this isn't about revenge. This is about building something that works. If you can adapt to the new reality, if you can work collaboratively and respect the expertise of the people around you, then there's a place for you in the organization. And if I can't?" I met his eyes directly. "Then you'll need to find another job. I won't sacrifice the success of a $200 million project to protect your ego." The conversation continued late into the night, covering ground we should have explored years earlier. David asked questions about my clients, my methods, my long-term goals. For the first time in our marriage, he seemed genuinely interested in understanding what I did and how I thought about problems. But underneath his curiosity, I could sense his struggle with the fundamental shift in our relationship's power dynamic. He had built his identity around being the primary breadwinner, the decision-maker, the one with the important career. Learning that his wife had not only equaled his professional success, but far exceeded it was forcing him to confront assumptions he had never questioned. As we finally headed to bed around midnight, David paused at the bottom of the stairs. "Sarah, I'm sorry. For today, for all the times I didn't listen, for making you feel like you had to hide who you really are." I nodded, accepting his apology, but knowing that words alone wouldn't repair the damage that had been done. "We have a lot of work to do, David, both professionally and personally." "Are we going to be okay?" he asked, and for the first time that day, he sounded vulnerable rather than defensive. "I don't know," I admitted, "but for the first time in years, we're having an honest conversation. That's a start." The first day of my new position at Meridian Defense Solutions began at 6 in the morning, 2 hours before David typically arrived at the office. I had requested the early start specifically to avoid the awkwardness of walking into the building together, but also because I needed time to establish my authority before the regular workday began. My new office was on the 28th floor, 3 levels above David's department, and 4 floors higher than he had ever been authorized to access. The space was twice the size of our living room at home, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Margaret Thornton had insisted that I take the corner office, explaining that it would send the right message about my position in the company hierarchy. Standing at those windows that first morning, watching the sunrise paint the skyline in shades of gold and amber, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete professional autonomy. For the first time since my military retirement, I was operating in an environment where my decisions carried real weight, where my expertise was not only acknowledged, but desperately needed. The morning briefing materials that Janet Reeves had prepared for me painted a sobering picture of Meridian's logistics operation. Cost overruns were endemic, delivery schedules were consistently missed, and client satisfaction scores had been declining for 3 consecutive quarters. Most troubling were the internal reports documenting resistance to process improvements and a corporate culture that prioritized maintaining comfortable routines over achieving optimal results. My first meeting was with the logistics department's senior staff, 15 managers and supervisors who would now be reporting directly to me. David was among them, sitting at the far end of the conference table, avoiding eye contact and looking like he hadn't slept in days. The others were a mix of career professionals, some of whom I recognized from various company events over the years, though they were clearly struggling to reconcile their memories of David's quiet wife, with the woman now sitting at the head of their conference table. "Good morning, everyone," I began, my voice carrying the authority I had developed during my military career. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, And as of today, I'm responsible for the strategic direction and operational efficiency of this division. I know this transition may feel sudden for some of you, but I want to assure you that my primary focus is on building a team that can deliver exceptional results for our clients and our shareholders. The room was silent except for the soft scratching of pens on notepads. I could see several people stealing glances at David, trying to read his expression, wondering how this unprecedented situation would play out. Over the next 30 days, I'll be conducting individual performance reviews with each of you, I continued. These won't be punitive evaluations, but rather opportunities for us to discuss your current responsibilities, your professional goals, and how we can optimize your contributions to the team's success. Some of you may find your roles expanding, others may discover new opportunities that better match your skills, and yes, some positions may be eliminated if they're not adding value to our operations. A middle-aged man named Richard Palmer, who I knew had been with the company for over a decade, raised his hand tentatively. Ms. Mitchell, will these evaluations take into account our previous relationships with you? I mean, given that some of us know you in a personal context? It was a diplomatic way of asking whether I would show favoritism toward David, or, conversely, whether I might penalize people who had witnessed his behavior toward me at company events over the years. The question demonstrated exactly the kind of political awareness that would be essential for anyone hoping to survive the reorganization. Mr. Palmer, I replied, I appreciate you raising that concern directly. Let me be absolutely clear. Every person in this room will be evaluated solely on their professional performance, their contribution to team objectives, and their ability to adapt to new operational standards. Personal relationships, whether positive or negative, will have no bearing on employment decisions. Anyone who feels they cannot work effectively under those conditions should let me know immediately. I let my eyes sweep the room, making brief contact with each person, including David. That said, I expect absolute professionalism from everyone, including myself. We're all adults, and we're all here to do a job. I trust that everyone can maintain appropriate boundaries and focus on our shared mission. The next 2 hours were spent reviewing current projects, identifying immediate inefficiencies, and establishing new reporting protocols. It was during this discussion that the full extent of the department's problems became clear. Projects that should have taken 6 months were stretching into 18-month ordeals. Budget estimates were consistently off by 20 to 30%. Client complaints were being handled defensively rather than being used as opportunities for improvement. Most revealing was the dynamic among the staff themselves. There were obvious factions, competing priorities, and a general atmosphere of resignation that suggested people had given up on the possibility of meaningful change. Several times during the meeting, I caught individuals rolling their eyes or exchanging skeptical glances when colleagues proposed solutions to ongoing problems. David contributed almost nothing to the discussion, speaking only when directly asked a question, and then offering responses that were technically accurate but strategically useless. It was painful to watch someone I had lived with for 15 years reveal himself to be so thoroughly mediocre in a professional setting. After the general meeting concluded, I called David into my office for our first formal conversation as supervisor and subordinate. He entered hesitantly, closing the door behind him and taking the chair across from my desk like a student being called to the principal's office. "This is awkward," he said, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It doesn't have to be," I replied, opening the file that contained his employment records. "We're both professionals, and we both want this company to succeed. The question is whether you can separate your personal feelings from your professional responsibilities." I spread his performance evaluations across the desk, documents that painted a clear picture of declining effectiveness over the past 3 years. Missed deadlines, budget overruns, complaints from subordinates about micromanagement and poor communication. It was the record of someone who had become comfortable with mediocrity, who had stopped challenging himself to grow and improve. "David, I need to ask you directly. Do you want to keep working here?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Of course I want to keep my job. This is my career, Sarah. It's what I do." "But are you happy with what you're doing?" I pressed. "Looking at these evaluations, it seems like you've been struggling for a while. Maybe this transition is an opportunity for you to consider whether this role is really the best fit for your skills." His face flushed with anger. "You're trying to push me out." "I'm trying to understand whether you're capable of the kind of performance this division needs," I corrected. "Because frankly, based on these records, you're not meeting the standards I'm going to require from my team." The next hour was one of the most difficult conversations of our marriage. David was forced to confront the reality of his professional limitations while I had to balance my role as his supervisor with my history as his wife. We discussed specific projects where his performance had been substandard, analyzed the feedback from his colleagues and subordinates, and explored options for improvement. What emerged from that conversation was a picture of someone who had been coasting for years, relying on institutional knowledge and personal relationships, rather than developing new skills or embracing innovative approaches. David had become comfortable with being adequate, and adequate was no longer sufficient. "I'm going to give you a choice," I said finally. "You can accept a lateral transfer to a different department, where you'll report to someone else and work on projects that better match your current skill level. Or you can stay in logistics and prove that you're capable of meeting the higher standards this division will require. But if you choose to stay, you'll be evaluated just like everyone else, and if you don't improve, you'll be terminated." David was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the city below. "What would you do?" he asked finally. "I can't make that decision for you," I replied. "But I can tell you that staying here and failing would be worse for both of us than making a clean transition to something where you can succeed." The conversation was interrupted by a call from Margaret Thornton's office, summoning me to an emergency meeting about a crisis with one of our largest government contracts. A critical supply shipment to a military base in Eastern Europe had been delayed due to logistics failures, potentially compromising a classified operation and putting soldiers at risk. "I have to go," I told David. "Think about what we discussed and let me know your decision by tomorrow morning." The emergency meeting lasted 4 hours and involved video conferences with Pentagon officials, military commanders in the field, and executives from 3 different subcontractor companies. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes crisis management that I had specialized in during my military career, and I found myself energized by the challenge in a way I hadn't felt in years. The solution required rerouting supplies through alternative channels, negotiating emergency transport with civilian carriers, and coordinating with allied military forces to provide temporary support until our delayed shipment could arrive. It was complex, expensive, and required making decisions with incomplete information under extreme time pressure. By the end of the day, we had developed a recovery plan that would get critical supplies to the affected base within 48 hours, minimize the operational impact, and prevent similar failures in the future. The Pentagon officials were impressed. Margaret Thornton was relieved, and I had demonstrated exactly why the board had been willing to pay me so handsomely for my expertise. When I finally returned to my office that evening, I found David waiting in the hallway outside my door. He looked exhausted and somehow smaller than he had that morning, as if the weight of our earlier conversation had physically diminished him. "I've made my decision," he said quietly. "And?" "I want to transfer to the contracts division. Richard Morrison said they have an opening for someone with my experience, and I think I'd be happier doing work that doesn't require the kind of innovation you're bringing to logistics." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. "I think that's probably the right choice." "Sarah," he said, "I want you to know that I'm proud of what you accomplished today. Janet told me about the crisis you handled, how you saved that military operation. I never could have done what you did. It was the first time in our marriage that David had acknowledged my professional capabilities without qualification or caveat. The admission cost him something, I could see it in his face, but it also seemed to free him from the burden of competing with me in an arena where he was clearly outmatched. "Thank you," I said simply. As we walked to the elevator together that evening, maintaining the careful professional distance that would now define our working relationship, I realized that we had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. We were no longer the couple who had started this journey together that morning. We were two individuals who happened to share a history, trying to find a way to coexist in a world that had been fundamentally altered by truth. 3 weeks into my new role, I was sitting in my office reviewing quarterly performance metrics, when my assistant knocked on the door with an expression that suggested either very good news or very bad news. Jennifer Walsh had been assigned to me by Margaret Thornton's office, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who had previously worked for 2 other executive directors before they were quietly asked to resign for incompetence. "Colonel Mitchell," she said, using the title I had requested from all staff members. "There's a situation developing that requires your immediate attention. We have a delegation from the European Defense Agency arriving tomorrow for an unscheduled inspection of our NATO supply chain operations." I looked up from the spreadsheet I had been analyzing, immediately understanding the implications. The European Defense Agency didn't conduct surprise inspections unless they had received credible reports of serious operational failures. Given the crisis we had managed 3 weeks earlier, when critical supplies to the Eastern European base had been delayed, this visit was almost certainly connected to that incident. "How much notice did they give us?" I asked, already reaching for my phone to contact the relevant department heads. 4 hours, Jennifer replied grimly. "Their advance team is already en route from Brussels. They'll be here at 8 tomorrow morning, and they're bringing forensic accountants." Forensic accountants. That meant they weren't just investigating operational failures. They were looking for evidence of fraud, embezzlement, or criminal negligence. The kind of investigation that could result in criminal charges, massive financial penalties, and the loss of government contracts worth billions of dollars. I spent the next hour on conference calls with Margaret Thornton, the legal department, and the heads of every division that had any connection to our European operations. What emerged from those conversations was a troubling picture of systemic problems that went far deeper than the single delayed shipment that had triggered the current crisis. For the past 2 years, Meridian had been consistently late on deliveries to NATO partners, had failed to meet quality standards on multiple contracts, and had been charging premium prices for services that were being delivered at bargain basement quality levels. The European Defense Agency had been documenting these failures, building a case that could potentially result in Meridian being banned from all future European contracts. "How bad is this?" Margaret asked during our final call of the evening. "It's bad," I admitted. "But it's not insurmountable. The problems are real, but they're operational rather than criminal. We can fix this, but only if we're completely transparent about what went wrong and demonstrate concrete steps we're taking to prevent future failures." "What do you need from me?" "Complete authority to restructure our European operations, effective immediately. No interference from other department heads, no budget constraints, and no political considerations. If we're going to survive this inspection, I need to be able to make decisions without having to navigate corporate bureaucracy." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You have it. Whatever you need." The next morning, I arrived at the office at 5:30. To find that Jennifer had already prepared comprehensive briefing materials on every aspect of our European operations. The woman was proving to be invaluable. She had the kind of organizational skills and attention to detail that made complex projects manageable. The European delegation arrived precisely at 8, led by a stern-faced woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, who introduced herself as the Deputy Director of Contract Compliance. She was accompanied by 3 forensic accountants, 2 logistics specialists, and a translator who seemed unnecessary since everyone spoke perfect English. "Colonel Mitchell," Dr. Vasquez said, extending a firm handshake. "I understand you're..." the new director of logistics operations. I trust you've been briefed on the purpose of our visit. I have, I replied, gesturing toward the large conference room where Jennifer had arranged detailed charts and documentation covering every aspect of our European contracts. I've prepared a comprehensive review of our operations, including frank assessments of where we've fallen short and specific plans for improvement. The inspection lasted 8 hours, during which the European team examined every aspect of our supply chain operations with the thoroughness of surgeons performing a complex operation. They reviewed financial records, interviewed key personnel, and tested our operational systems in real-time scenarios. What impressed me most about Dr. Vasquez and her team was their professionalism. They weren't there to play gotcha games or to embarrass American contractors. They were there to determine whether Meridian could be trusted to fulfill its obligations to European partners who were literally depending on our services for their national security. The most difficult moment came when they reviewed the delayed shipment that had triggered the current crisis. The forensic accountants had traced the failure to a series of poor decisions by middle management, including David's former department, that had prioritized cost savings over operational reliability. This particular incident, Dr. Vasquez explained, resulted in a 48-hour delay in critical communications equipment reaching a forward operating base. During those 48 hours, our personnel were operating with compromised communication security in a hostile environment. The weight of that statement hit me like a physical blow. David's department had been so focused on meeting budget targets that they had chosen cheaper, less reliable shipping methods for critical military equipment. The delay hadn't just been an inconvenience, it had put soldiers' lives at risk. Dr. Vasquez, I said, I need you to understand that the management team responsible for that decision is no longer in place. We've completely restructured our decision-making process to prioritize operational reliability over cost considerations. That's what we've heard, she replied. But we need to see evidence of systemic change, not just personnel changes. The afternoon session focused on the improvements I had implemented over the past 3 weeks. I walked them through the new quality control protocols, the enhanced supplier verification systems, and the real-time tracking capabilities that would prevent future delays. More importantly, I explained the cultural changes we were implementing to ensure that operational decisions were made by people with actual field experience, rather than by managers who had never left their offices. Colonel Mitchell, one of the forensic accountants, said, "Your military record indicates extensive experience with supply chain management in combat zones. How do you plan to apply that expertise to civilian contractor operations?" It was exactly the kind of question I had been hoping for, an opportunity to demonstrate that our improvements weren't just cosmetic changes, but fundamental shifts in how we approached logistics challenges. In military operations, I explained, failure isn't just expensive, it's fatal. That creates a culture where reliability and precision are non-negotiable values, where every decision is evaluated based on its potential impact on mission success and personnel safety. We're implementing that same mindset in our civilian operations. The questioning continued for another 2 hours, covering everything from supplier relationships to quality assurance protocols. By the end of the day, I was exhausted but cautiously optimistic. The European team had been thorough but fair, and I sensed that they were genuinely interested in finding a path forward, rather than simply documenting failures. Dr. Vasquez requested a private meeting with me before the delegation departed. We sat in my office as the sun was setting, 2 professional women who had spent their careers in male-dominated industries, discussing the future of a multi-billion-dollar business relationship. "Colonel Mitchell," she began, "I'm going to be direct with you. Your company's European operations have been substandard for the past 2 years. We've been documenting failures, cost overruns, and quality issues that would normally result in contract termination." My heart sank, but I maintained my composure. "I understand. However," she continued, "today's presentation has convinced me that Meridian is finally taking these issues seriously. Your proposed improvements are comprehensive and realistic, and your background suggests you have the expertise to implement them successfully. What are you recommending to your superiors? Conditional continuation of existing contracts, with mandatory performance benchmarks and quarterly reviews. If you can demonstrate sustained improvement over the next 12 months, we'll consider expanding our partnership. If not, we'll be looking for alternative suppliers. It wasn't the unconditional endorsement I had hoped for, but it was far better than the contract termination I had feared. We had bought ourselves time to prove that the changes we were implementing were genuine and sustainable. After the European delegation departed, I called Margaret Thornton to brief her on the outcome. She was relieved, but not surprised. She had hired me specifically to handle this kind of crisis, and the successful navigation of the inspection validated her decision. "Sarah," she said, "I want you to know that today's performance has been noticed at the highest levels of the company. The board is extremely impressed with how you handled this situation. Thank you, but we're not out of the woods yet. We have 12 months to prove that we can consistently deliver on our promises. I have complete confidence in your ability to do exactly that." That evening, I found myself working late in my office, reviewing the day's events and planning the next phase of our operational improvements. The building was mostly empty. The cleaning crews had finished their rounds, and the city lights were beginning to twinkle in the darkness outside my windows. I was surprised when David knocked on my door around 9 o'clock. He had been working in the contracts division for 2 weeks, and we had maintained a professional but distant relationship during business hours. Our personal conversations had been limited to logistics about household responsibilities and social obligations. "I heard about the inspection today," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Jennifer mentioned that it went well." "Better than expected," I admitted, "but we still have a lot of work ahead of us." David was quiet for a moment, and I could see him struggling with something he wanted to say. "Sarah, I need to apologize. Not just for what happened in the conference room that day, but for not seeing you, for not understanding what you were capable of." I looked up from the reports I had been reviewing, surprised by the genuine remorse in his voice. "David, no. Let me finish," he said. "Today, watching how you handled that crisis, seeing the respect those European officials had for you, I realized that I've been married to someone extraordinary for 15 years, and I was too selfish and insecure to appreciate it." The admission hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of all the years we had wasted, all the opportunities for genuine partnership that we had missed because of his need to feel superior, and my willingness to make myself smaller to accommodate his ego. "I don't know if we can fix our marriage," he continued, "but I want you to know that I'm proud of you. What you did today, what you've built with your business, it's remarkable. And I'm sorry it took a crisis for me to see it." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not because his words solved anything, but because they represented a level of honesty we had never achieved in our relationship. For the first time, David was seeing me as I actually was, rather than as he needed me to be. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means more than you know." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, two people who had shared a life together, acknowledging the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. Outside my office windows, the city continued its relentless rhythm, millions of people pursuing their own dreams and ambitions, fighting their own battles between who they were and who they wanted to become. The next morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that the changes we had implemented were sustainable. But for now, in the quiet of my office, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. I had built something real, something that mattered, something that made a difference in the world. And for the first time in years, I was exactly where I belonged. 6 months after the European inspection, I was standing in the Pentagon briefing room, addressing a panel of senior military officials about the revolution we had implemented in defense logistics. The invitation to present our innovations to the Joint Chiefs of Staff represented a level of recognition that even I hadn't anticipated when I first signed my contract with Meridian. General Patricia Williams, the same officer who had written one of my recommendation letters years earlier, introduced me to the assembled group with words that still gave me chills. Colonel Mitchell's work has fundamentally changed how we think about supply chain management in modern warfare. The efficiency improvements she's implemented have saved the Department of Defense over $400 million in the past 6 months alone. The presentation covered the comprehensive overhaul we had achieved at Meridian, but more importantly, it demonstrated how military-tested logistics principles could be scaled across the entire defense contracting industry. The audience included generals, admirals, and senior civilian officials who were responsible for managing supply chains that spanned the globe and supported operations in dozens of countries. As I clicked through slides showing our performance improvements, I caught sight of familiar faces in the audience. Some were colleagues from my active duty years. Others were contractors I had worked with on various projects. All of them were seeing me in a context they had never imagined possible. Not as someone's wife or a retired officer filling time with consulting work, but as a strategic leader whose innovations were reshaping their industry. The questions that followed my presentation were substantive and challenging, exactly the kind of technical discussion I had been craving for years. We discussed real-time inventory management, predictive maintenance protocols, and the integration of artificial intelligence into supply chain decision-making. These were conversations that required deep expertise and strategic thinking. The kind of intellectual engagement that had been missing from my life during the years when David dismissed my ideas as irrelevant. After the formal presentation concluded, General Williams approached me with a proposal that would change everything. Once again, "Sarah," she said, "the Secretary of Defense has been following your work closely. We'd like to offer you a position as Director of Defense Logistics Innovation, reporting directly to the Pentagon. It would mean leaving Meridian, but it would also give you the opportunity to implement your strategies across the entire military supply chain." The offer was stunning in its scope and implications. The position would make me one of the most influential logistics professionals in the world, with authority over supply chain operations that supported every branch of the military. It was the kind of opportunity that came along once in a career, if at all. "I'm honored by the offer," I told her, "but I need time to consider it. There are personal factors that complicate the decision." General Williams nodded understandingly. "Of course. Take all the time you need, but we'd like an answer within the next month. The position becomes available in January, and we'd want you to start immediately." The flight back to our city gave me 3 hours to think about the implications of the Pentagon offer. Accepting it would mean relocating to Washington, D.C., and probably ending my marriage to David. While we had developed a more honest relationship over the past 6 months, we were still struggling to rebuild trust and find a way forward together. David had thrived in his new role in the contracts division, working on projects that matched his skills and temperament. He had even received positive performance reviews for the first time in years. Our personal relationship remained complicated, but we had managed to establish a functional partnership based on mutual respect rather than the toxic dynamic that had characterized our marriage for so long. When I arrived home that evening, I found David in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the kind of attention to detail he had never shown during the years when he expected me to handle all domestic responsibilities. It was one of many small changes that had emerged from our crisis. He had begun to truly appreciate the work that went into maintaining a household, just as I had finally received recognition for my professional contributions. "How was Washington?" he asked, looking up from the vegetables he was chopping. "Productive," I said, setting down my briefcase and accepting the glass of wine he offered. "They want me to take a position at the Pentagon." David's knife stopped moving. "What kind of position?" I explained the offer, watching his face as he processed the implications. This wasn't just another consulting contract or a promotion within Meridian. This was a complete transformation of my career trajectory, one that would establish me as one of the most important logistics professionals in the world. "That's incredible, Sarah," he said finally. "It's exactly the kind of recognition you deserve." "But it would mean moving to DC," I said, "and probably ending our marriage." We both knew that our relationship couldn't survive another major transition. We had made progress over the past 6 months, but we were still rebuilding from the foundation up. The stress of a cross-country move, combined with the demands of such a high-profile position, would likely destroy whatever fragile progress we had made. "Maybe that's not a bad thing," David said quietly. "Maybe we've been trying to save something that was already broken." It was a painful conversation, but also a necessary one. We spent the evening discussing the practical implications of divorce, the division of assets, and the logistics of separating two lives that had been intertwined for 15 years. But more importantly, we talked about what we had learned from our crisis and how it had changed us both. "I used to think that success meant making other people smaller," David admitted. "I needed to be the smartest person in the room, the one with the most important job, the one whose opinions mattered most. I didn't realize that diminishing you was diminishing both of us. And I used to think that love meant making myself smaller," I replied. "I thought that if I was too successful, too ambitious, too visible, it would threaten our relationship. I didn't realize that hiding who I really was meant we never had a real relationship at all." The next morning, I called General Williams and accepted the Pentagon position. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, like stepping off a cliff while simultaneously learning to fly. For the first time in my adult life, I was making a major life decision based solely on my own ambitions and capabilities, without considering how it would affect someone else's ego or comfort level. The news of my appointment spread quickly through both the defense contracting community and Meridian's executive offices. Margaret Thornton called to congratulate me and to express her regret at losing me, but also to acknowledge that the Pentagon position represented the kind of opportunity that couldn't be refused. "You've transformed this company," she told me during our final meeting. "The European contracts are performing better than they have in years. Our client satisfaction scores are at all-time highs, and our operational efficiency has improved by 40%. More importantly, you've changed the culture here. People are thinking differently about what's possible." The transition process took 2 months, during which I trained my replacement and ensured that the improvements we had implemented would be sustained after my departure. Jennifer Walsh, my assistant, had been promoted to Deputy Director of Operations, and she was proving to be an excellent leader in her own right. David and I used those 2 months to work with lawyers and financial advisors to arrange an amicable divorce. The process was surprisingly straightforward, partly because we had finally learned to communicate honestly with each other, and partly because my business success meant that financial considerations weren't contentious. "I want you to keep the house," I told him during one of our meetings with the attorneys. "I'll be living in DC, and you've put a lot of work into the property." "Sarah, that's not fair. The house is worth more than my share of our other assets." "David, I'm about to start a job that pays more than both our previous salaries combined. I don't need the house, and it makes sense for you to have stability during this transition." The generosity wasn't motivated by guilt or a desire to maintain control. It was simply a practical decision made by someone who finally had the resources to be generous without sacrificing her own security. My last day at Meridian was marked by a farewell reception that drew executives from across the defense contracting industry. People who had known me only as David's wife were now treating me as a peer and a respected colleague. The transformation was complete, but it also felt like a beginning rather than an ending. As I cleaned out my office that final evening, removing personal items and organizing files for my successor, I found myself thinking about the woman who had walked into that conference room 8 months earlier. She had been invisible, dismissed, considered worthless by the man who was supposed to value her most. Now she was about to take on one of the most influential positions in American defense logistics. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's public humiliation had been the catalyst for everything that followed. If he hadn't called me worthless in front of his colleagues, I might never have revealed the business empire I had been building in secret. If his boss hadn't witnessed that moment of cruelty, the board might never have recognized my potential value to their organization. Sometimes the most devastating moments in our lives turn out to be the ones that set us free. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my new office in the Pentagon, looking out at the Potomac River and preparing for my first briefing as Director of Defense Logistics Innovation. The challenges ahead were enormous: modernizing supply chains that had been built during the Cold War, integrating new technologies into systems that supported millions of service members worldwide, and managing budgets that were larger than the GDP of most countries. But for the first time in years, I felt equal to the challenges ahead. I had spent too many years making myself smaller to fit into someone else's vision of who I should be. Now I was finally free to discover how large I could become. 2 years into my role at the Pentagon, I received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during my years as David's dismissed wife. The Secretary of Defense wanted me to lead a classified briefing for NATO allies about revolutionary changes in military logistics that could reshape how Allied forces operated together in future conflicts. The meeting was scheduled to take place at the Secure Conference Facility in Brussels, the same city where Dr. Elena Vasquez had originated the inspection that helped launch my current career trajectory. As I prepared my presentation materials in my Pentagon office, I reflected on how dramatically my world had expanded since that confrontation in Meridian's conference room. My innovations in military supply chain management had exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The integrated logistics network I had designed was now supporting operations across 4 continents, reducing costs by 37% while improving delivery reliability to levels that had been considered impossible just 5 years earlier. More importantly, the system had proven itself under combat conditions, successfully supporting rapid deployment operations that had saved lives and achieved strategic objectives that would have been unattainable under the old logistics framework. The Brussels briefing would be my opportunity to share these innovations with defense leaders from 28 allied nations, potentially revolutionizing how democratic nations coordinated their military supply chains. It was the kind of strategic influence that extended far beyond logistics, touching on fundamental questions about how free societies could work together to defend their shared values. The morning before my departure for Brussels, I received an unexpected phone call from David. We had maintained cordial contact since our divorce, exchanging updates about our careers and occasionally meeting for coffee when my work brought me back to our former city. The relationship was friendly but distant, like former colleagues who had shared an office for many years before moving on to different companies. "Sarah," he said, "I wanted to call before you left for Brussels. I saw the article about your NATO presentation in Defense Weekly. It's incredible what you've accomplished." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely touched that he had been following my work. "How are things going with you?" "Really well, actually. I got promoted to Senior Contracts Manager last month, and I'm working on some interesting projects with the State Department. Nothing as dramatic as what you're doing, but it's good work that matches my skills." The conversation was warm, but tinged with melancholy, a reminder of what we might have achieved together if we had learned to support each other's ambitions instead of competing for relevance. David had found his place in work that utilized his analytical abilities without requiring the kind of strategic innovation that had made him feel inadequate during our marriage. "Sarah," he said as our conversation was ending, "I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Not just for the career success, but for having the courage to demand the respect you deserved. I know it couldn't have been easy to rebuild your life from scratch. It wasn't easy," I admitted, "but it was necessary. We both deserved better than what we were settling for." The flight to Brussels gave me time to review my presentation materials and reflect on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The classified briefing would cover innovations that were still years away from public disclosure, technologies and strategies that would define military logistics for the next generation of conflicts. The most significant breakthrough had been the development of predictive logistics algorithms that could anticipate supply needs before commanders in the field even realized they were developing shortages. By analyzing patterns in communication traffic, weather data, enemy activity reports, and equipment performance metrics, our systems could predict with remarkable accuracy when and where critical supplies would be needed. The technology had been tested extensively in training exercises and limited deployment scenarios, consistently outperforming human planners in both speed and accuracy. More importantly, it freed up qualified personnel to focus on strategic decision-making rather than routine supply management, multiplying the effectiveness of logistics officers throughout the military hierarchy. The Brussels facility was exactly what you would expect from a NATO security installation: imposing concrete architecture, multiple layers of security screening, and the kind of sterile efficiency that characterized international military cooperation. I arrived 2 hours before the scheduled briefing to coordinate with the technical staff and ensure that all classified materials were properly secured. The conference room where I would be presenting could have hosted a small university lecture, with tiered seating for nearly 200 participants and sophisticated audio-visual equipment that would allow real-time translation into 6 languages. As delegates filed in from various allied nations, I was struck by the diversity of uniforms, languages, and military traditions represented in the room. General Williams introduced me to the assembly with words that still gave me chills every time I heard them. Colonel Mitchell has revolutionized American military logistics in ways that were previously thought impossible. The innovations you'll hear about today represent the future of Allied military cooperation. My presentation lasted 90 minutes, covering everything from basic supply chain optimization to advanced artificial intelligence applications in battlefield logistics. The questions that followed were sophisticated and challenging, reflecting the high level of expertise represented in the room. A French general asked about the cybersecurity implications of networked logistics systems. A German admiral wanted to know how the predictive algorithms would perform in maritime environments. A Canadian colonel inquired about the training requirements for personnel who would operate the new systems. Each question represented hours of research and development that my team had conducted over the past 2 years. Answering them required not just technical knowledge, but strategic understanding of how different allied nations approached military logistics based on their unique geographical, political, and resource constraints. The most significant moment came when Dr. Elena Vasquez, now promoted to Director of European Defense Logistics, approached me during the coffee break. "Colonel Mitchell," she said, "I have to admit that when I first met you during that inspection at Meridian, I never imagined you would achieve this level of influence. Your work is reshaping how we think about military cooperation across the alliance." Thank you, Dr. Vasquez. That inspection was actually a turning point for me. It forced me to prove that the changes we were implementing were genuine and sustainable. Well, you certainly succeeded. The European Defense Agency is now using your methodologies as the standard for evaluating all logistics contractors. You've raised the bar for the entire industry. The afternoon session focused on implementation strategies for adapting American innovations to the specific needs of different allied nations. This was where my military experience proved most valuable. I understood not just the technical aspects of logistics, but the cultural and organizational factors that determined whether new systems would be successfully adopted. Working with the British delegation, we developed a pilot program for testing predictive logistics in their Mediterranean operations. The German representatives were interested in adapting our inventory management systems for their rapid deployment capabilities. The Scandinavian countries wanted to explore how our cold weather logistics innovations could improve their Arctic defense preparations. By the end of the day, we had established 12 different pilot programs that would test various aspects of the American logistics innovations in allied military contexts. If successful, these programs would be expanded across the entire NATO alliance, creating an integrated logistics network that could support coordinated operations on a scale never before achieved. The reception that evening was held in a centuries-old building that had witnessed countless diplomatic negotiations and military planning sessions. As I moved through the crowd of senior military officers and defense officials, I was struck by how natural it felt to be operating at this level of international strategic planning. 3 years earlier, I had been dismissed as worthless by a middle manager at a mid-sized defense contractor. Now I was helping to shape military policy for the world's most powerful military alliance. The transformation still seemed surreal, but it also felt inevitable in retrospect. During dinner, I found myself seated next to Lieutenant General Marcus Thompson, the American military attaché to NATO, who had been following my work since my early days at the Pentagon. "Sarah," he said, "I have to ask you something that I've been curious about for months. How do you maintain perspective on what you've accomplished? The transition from where you were to where you are now is almost unprecedented." It was a thoughtful question that forced me to consider not just the external changes in my career, but the internal transformation that had made those changes possible. "I think the key," I said, "was learning to separate my worth from other people's recognition of that worth. For too many years, I let someone else's limitations define what I thought I was capable of achieving. But surely the professional success validates your abilities in a way that must feel satisfying." Success is gratifying," I admitted. "But what's most important is that I'm finally doing work that utilizes my capabilities fully. I spent years accepting positions and relationships that required me to operate at maybe 30% of my potential. Now I'm challenged every day to grow and learn and contribute at the highest level I'm capable of reaching." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics that ranged from military strategy to personal development to the changing role of women in defense leadership. It was exactly the kind of substantive discussion that I had been craving during those years when dinner party conversations focused on sports scores and home renovation projects. The next morning brought final coordination meetings with various national delegations, securing commitments for the pilot programs, and establishing timelines for implementation. By noon, we had formal agreements from 18 allied nations to participate in testing phases of the new logistics systems. As I prepared to return to Washington, Dr. Vasquez approached me one final time. "Colonel Mitchell, I have a proposal. That might interest you. The European Union is creating a new position for Director of Allied Logistics Coordination, reporting directly to the European Defense Agency. It would involve relocating to Brussels, but it would also give you the opportunity to implement your innovations across both NATO and EU defense structures." The offer was tempting, representing another dramatic expansion of my influence and responsibilities. But I had learned from my Pentagon decision that career opportunities, no matter how prestigious, needed to be evaluated in the context of my overall life goals and personal satisfaction. "I'm honored by the offer," I told her, "but I'm not ready to make another major life transition right now. I'm still learning and growing in my current role, and I think I can contribute more by continuing to develop innovations from within the American system." The flight back to Washington gave me time to process the success of the Brussels briefing and consider the trajectory of my career. In just 3 years, I had gone from being dismissed as worthless to being courted by international organizations for positions that would influence global military policy. But more importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment about what constituted meaningful work and personal fulfillment. The external validation was gratifying, but it was no longer necessary for my sense of self-worth. As the plane descended toward Dulles Airport, I looked out at the lights of the Washington metropolitan area and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I was home, returning to work that challenged and fulfilled me, in a life that I had built according to my own values and ambitions. 5 years after that devastating conference room confrontation, I found myself standing at the podium of the Kennedy Center, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the National Defense Leadership Summit. The invitation to speak at this prestigious event represented the pinnacle of recognition in my field. Previous keynote speakers had included secretaries of defense, 4-star generals, and Nobel laureates who had shaped military strategy for generations. The audience of nearly 3,000 included defense contractors, military leaders, government officials, and academic researchers from around the world. As I looked out at the sea of faces, I spotted several people whose presence carried special significance. General Williams was in the front row, beaming with pride at how far her former logistics coordinator had traveled. Dr. Vasquez had flown in from Brussels specifically to hear my presentation. Even Margaret Thornton from Meridian was there, representing the company that had unknowingly launched my transformation. But the most meaningful presence was David, sitting in the middle section with his new wife, Linda, a kind woman who worked as a nurse practitioner and who had helped him discover parts of himself that had been buried under years of insecurity and competitive resentment. Their marriage appeared to be built on mutual support and genuine appreciation, everything ours had failed to achieve. David had requested permission to attend through my office, explaining that he wanted to witness this moment not as my former husband, but as someone who had learned important lessons from our shared experience. His presence felt appropriate rather than awkward, a symbol of how both of us had grown beyond the people we had been during our destructive years together. My speech was titled, Beyond Logistics: How Military Innovation Reshapes Global Security, but the real theme was transformation, how individuals, organizations, and entire systems could evolve beyond their apparent limitations when given the opportunity and support to reach their full potential. 7 years ago, I began, I was sitting in a corporate conference room, listening to someone describe me as worthless in front of a group of professionals who nodded politely and moved on with their day. Today, I stand before you as the architect of logistics systems that support military operations across 6 continents, innovations that have saved billions of dollars and countless lives. The opening drew appreciative murmurs from the audience. But I wasn't sharing the story for sympathy or dramatic effect. I was using it to illustrate a fundamental principle about human potential that had broader implications for national security and organizational effectiveness. The question isn't how I transformed from worthless to valuable, I continued. The question is how many other people in our organizations, our communities, and our allied nations are operating far below their potential because someone has decided their contributions don't matter. The speech outlined the logistics innovations that had made me famous in defense circles, but more importantly, it explored how those innovations had emerged from recognizing and utilizing capabilities that traditional military hierarchies had overlooked. The predictive algorithms that had revolutionized supply chain management had been developed by incorporating insights from enlisted personnel who understood operational realities that never appeared in official reports. The integrated logistics networks that now supported NATO operations had been designed by bringing together expertise from military veterans, civilian contractors, academic researchers, and even former adversaries who had developed innovative solutions to similar problems. The key insight was that breakthrough innovations almost always came from combining perspectives that had previously been kept separate. Military effectiveness, I explained, isn't just about having the best weapons or the most advanced technology. It's about creating systems that recognize talent wherever it exists, that value contribution over hierarchy, and that adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The audience was deeply engaged, asking questions that demonstrated they understood the broader implications of what I was describing. A Navy admiral wanted to know how the principles I was outlining could be applied to maritime operations. An Air Force general asked about the training requirements for personnel who would operate in these more flexible, adaptive systems. But the most significant question came from a young Army captain who had been selected to represent junior officers at the summit. "Colonel Mitchell," she said, "your presentation suggests that our current military culture may be systematically underutilizing the capabilities of our personnel. How do we change institutional cultures that have been established for generations?" It was exactly the kind of question that went to the heart of what I had learned during my own transformation. "Captain," I replied, "cultural change happens one decision at a time, one conversation at a time, one opportunity at a time. It starts with leaders who are secure enough in their own capabilities that they don't feel threatened by recognizing excellence in others." The afternoon panel discussion included defense leaders from 12 allied nations, exploring how the logistics innovations I had developed could be adapted to different military cultures and operational requirements. The conversation was conducted in 3 languages simultaneously, with real-time translation allowing participants to engage in their native tongues while maintaining perfect comprehension across cultural boundaries. During the panel, I found myself thinking about the contrast between this sophisticated international dialogue and the petty office politics that had characterized my experience at Meridian. The difference wasn't just in scale or importance. It was in the fundamental assumption that everyone present had valuable contributions to make to the collective mission. The French representative described how predictive logistics had improved their African deployment operations. The German delegate outlined efficiency improvements in their engineering support systems. The British participant explained how integrated supply networks had enhanced their special operations capabilities. Each presentation built on the others, creating a comprehensive picture of how individual innovations could be combined to achieve strategic advantages that no single nation could accomplish alone. It was exactly the kind of collaborative problem-solving that I had always believed was possible, but had rarely experienced in traditional military or corporate hierarchies. The reception that evening was held in the Kennedy Center's Hall of States, a magnificent space that seemed designed for celebrating achievements that transcended individual recognition. As I moved through the crowd of distinguished guests, I was approached by countless people who wanted to discuss potential collaborations, share their own experiences with organizational transformation, or simply express appreciation for ideas that had influenced their own work. One conversation particularly stood out. A young logistics officer from the Marine Corps approached me with obvious nervousness, clearly working up the courage to speak. "Colonel Mitchell," she said, "I wanted to thank you for your presentation today. I've been struggling with feeling like my ideas aren't valued in my current assignment, and hearing your story gives me hope that things can change." The interaction reminded me of my own younger self, full of capability and ambition, but struggling to find environments where those qualities were recognized and supported. "What kind of ideas are you working on?" I asked. She described innovative approaches to equipment maintenance that could reduce costs while improving reliability, strategies that she had developed based on her engineering background but that her supervisors had dismissed as too complicated to implement. The ideas were sophisticated and practical, exactly the kind of thinking that could generate significant improvements if given proper support. "Have you documented these concepts formally?" I asked. "I've written some informal reports, but I haven't submitted them through official channels because I don't think anyone would take them seriously." I handed her my business card. "Send me your analysis. If the ideas are as promising as they sound, I'll make sure they reach people who can appreciate their value." The young officer's face lit up with gratitude and excitement. It was exactly the kind of moment that had made my own transformation worthwhile. The opportunity to create pathways for others who might otherwise remain invisible in systems that were too rigid to recognize their potential. Later that evening, David approached me during a quiet moment when I was standing alone on the Kennedy Center's terrace, looking out at the Potomac River and the Washington Monument illuminated against The night sky. Sarah, he said, I wanted to congratulate you on your speech. It was extraordinary to watch you command that audience's attention and respect. Thank you for coming, I replied. It means something to have you here, to know that we've both grown beyond the people we were during our worst moments together. Linda helped me understand things about myself that I had never recognized, he said. She showed me that supporting someone else's success doesn't diminish your own value. It actually enhances it. We stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, two people who had shared a significant portion of our lives together, acknowledging how far we had both traveled from the dysfunction that had characterized our marriage. Do you ever regret how things ended between us? David asked. I regret the pain we caused each other, I said, but I don't regret that it ended. We were both trying to be people we weren't, and that was never going to work long term. The crisis forced us to discover who we really were. And are you happy with who you discovered? I considered the question carefully, thinking about the journey that had brought me from that humiliating conference room to this moment of recognition and achievement. I'm happy with the work I'm doing and the life I've built. More importantly, I'm happy with the person I've become. I'm not trying to be smaller or larger than I actually am. I'm just trying to be fully myself. The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics we had never been able to discuss during our marriage, our individual dreams, our professional aspirations, our evolving understanding of what constituted a meaningful life. It was the kind of honest dialogue that might have saved our relationship if we had been capable of it 15 years earlier. As the evening concluded, I returned to my hotel room with a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond professional achievement. The day had represented not just recognition of my work, but validation of the principles that had guided my transformation. Innovation emerged from recognizing underutilized capabilities. Excellence required creating environments where people could operate at their full potential. Leadership meant empowering others to achieve more than they thought possible. The next morning brought a phone call that would open yet another chapter in my evolving career. The Secretary of State wanted to discuss a position as Special Advisor for International Logistics Coordination, a role that would involve working directly with allied governments to implement the innovations I had developed across multiple theater operations. But for the first time in years, my response wasn't immediate enthusiasm for the next challenge. I had learned to evaluate opportunities not just based on their prestige or influence, but on whether they aligned with my long-term goals for both professional fulfillment and personal development. As I packed my bags for the return flight to ZA, Washington, I reflected on how much my relationship with success had evolved. The recognition was gratifying, but it was no longer the primary measure of my worth. What mattered most was the knowledge that I was contributing to something larger than myself, using my capabilities to their fullest extent, and creating opportunities for others to do the same. The woman who had been called worthless in that conference room 5 years earlier had discovered she was actually invaluable, not because external validation had changed her, but because she had finally learned to recognize and trust her own value. The call from the White House came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 6 years after that life-changing confrontation at Meridian. I was in my Pentagon office, reviewing intelligence reports about supply chain vulnerabilities in Eastern Europe, when my secure line rang with the distinctive tone that indicated a call from the highest levels of government. "Colonel Mitchell," said the voice on the other end. "This is Chief of Staff Catherine Reynolds. The President would like to meet with you this afternoon to discuss a matter of national importance. Can you be at the White House at 3 o'clock? The request was unprecedented in my experience. While I had briefed senior administration officials on logistics matters, I had never been summoned for a private meeting with the President. The timing suggested this was connected to the escalating tensions in Eastern Europe, where Russian military buildups had created the most serious security crisis since the Cold War. I spent the next 4 hours reviewing every classified report related to European supply chains, refreshing my knowledge of deployment capabilities, and preparing for what I suspected would be a discussion about rapid response logistics in the event of a major conflict. The intelligence painted a troubling picture of how quickly a regional crisis could spiral into a global confrontation requiring unprecedented coordination between allied forces. The West Wing of the White House was exactly as imposing as I had imagined, but what struck me most was the sense of barely controlled urgency that permeated the building. Staff members moved with the kind of focused intensity that indicated major decisions were being made. The kind of atmosphere that developed when abstract policy discussions suddenly became concrete operational planning. Catherine Reynolds met me in the Roosevelt Room, a space that seemed designed to remind visitors of the weight of presidential decision-making. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that had obviously propelled her to one of the most powerful positions in American government. "Colonel Mitchell," she said, "thank you for coming on such short notice. The President has been following your work closely, particularly your innovations in predictive logistics and international supply chain coordination. Recent developments have made those capabilities critically important to national security." She led me through a series of secured corridors to the Oval Office, where President Harrison was reviewing documents with the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of Defense. The President looked up as we entered, extending his hand with the kind of firm grip that suggested someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of lives. "Colonel Mitchell," he said, "I've been hearing remarkable things about your work. Secretary Morrison tells me you've revolutionized how we think about military logistics, and General Williams says you're the most innovative strategic thinker she's worked with in 30 years. The praise was gratifying, but I could sense that pleasantries were a prelude to something more substantial. The President gestured for me to take a seat in one of the chairs arranged around his desk, while the other officials positioned themselves for what was clearly going to be a serious, strategic discussion. "Colonel," the President continued, "I'm going to be direct with you. Our intelligence indicates that Russia is planning a major military operation in Eastern Europe within the next 6 months. If that happens, NATO will need to deploy forces and supplies on a scale not seen since World War II. The success of that deployment may determine whether we can prevent a regional conflict from becoming a global catastrophe." The Secretary of Defense opened a classified briefing folder and spread maps across the President's desk. "The logistical challenges are staggering," he explained. "We're talking about moving hundreds of thousands of personnel, millions of tons of equipment, and maintaining supply lines across thousands of miles of potentially hostile territory." I studied the maps, immediately recognizing the supply chain, bottlenecks that would determine the success or failure of any major deployment. The geographic constraints were significant: limited transportation infrastructure, vulnerable choke points, and the need to coordinate with allied nations that had different equipment standards and operational procedures. "Mr. President," I said, "these challenges are significant, but they're not insurmountable. The predictive logistics systems we've developed can optimize supply flows in real time, and our integration protocols with allied forces have been tested extensively in training exercises." "That's what we're hoping," the National Security Advisor interjected. "But this situation would push those systems beyond anything they've been designed to handle. We need someone who can oversee the entire logistics operation, someone with the authority to make real-time decisions that could affect the outcome of the conflict." The President leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious. "Colonel Mitchell, I'm offering you the position of Special Coordinator for Allied Logistics Operations, reporting directly to me through the National Security Council. If this crisis escalates, you would be responsible for coordinating supply chain operations for the largest military deployment in NATO history." The offer was staggering in its scope and implications. The position would make me one of the most influential people in the American national security apparatus, with authority that extended across military branches, government agencies, and international partnerships. It would also place me at the eye center of decisions that could determine the outcome of a potential global conflict. Mr. President, I said, I'm honored by your confidence, but I need to understand the full scope of what you're asking. Would this position supersede existing military command structures? In logistics matters, yes, the Secretary of Defense replied. You would have authority to redirect supplies, reallocate transportation assets, and coordinate with allied logistics commanders without going through traditional chain-of-command protocols. The position comes with emergency powers that can only be activated during national security crises. I spent the next hour reviewing the operational parameters of the proposed position, understanding both the unprecedented authority it would grant and the enormous responsibility it would entail. The decisions I would make could affect the lives of millions of military personnel and civilians, determine the success of Allied operations, and potentially influence the outcome of a conflict that could reshape global geopolitics. I need 24 hours to consider this, I told the President. The position you're describing would require me to reorganize my entire life around national security priorities. I want to make sure I can give it the complete commitment it deserves. President Harrison nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of thoughtful approach I was hoping for. Take all the time you need, but understand that we may need to activate this position with very little notice if the situation deteriorates. The drive back to my apartment that evening gave me time to process the magnitude of what had been offered. The position represented the pinnacle of influence in my field, the opportunity to apply everything I had learned about logistics and strategic planning to challenges that would define international security for generations. But it also represented a level of personal sacrifice that I hadn't fully considered during my previous career transitions. The special coordinator position would require essentially surrendering my private life to national service, being available 24 hours a day for crisis management, and making decisions under pressure that could have catastrophic consequences if I made mistakes. That night, I found myself walking through the streets of Washington, trying to gain perspective on a decision that felt almost overwhelming in its implications. The city was beautiful in the autumn evening, with the monuments illuminated against the darkening sky, but I was barely aware of my surroundings as I struggled to weigh personal ambitions against national responsibilities. I called my sister, Jennifer, who had been my closest confidant since my divorce from David. She was one of the few people who understood both my professional capabilities and my personal need for balance and fulfillment in life. Sarah, she said after I had explained the situation, this sounds like the kind of opportunity that comes along once in a lifetime, but it also sounds like the kind of position that could consume your entire existence. That's exactly what I'm struggling with, I admitted. The work would be incredibly meaningful, but it would also mean giving up any pretense of having a personal life outside of national service. Do you think you would regret not taking it? I considered the question carefully. I think I would regret not being able to contribute during a crisis where my expertise could make a real difference. But I also think I would regret organizing my entire life around crisis management and emergency response. The conversation continued for over an hour, exploring questions about purpose, sacrifice, and the balance between individual fulfillment and collective responsibility. Jennifer helped me recognize that the decision wasn't just about career advancement. It was about what kind of life I wanted to build and what kind of legacy I wanted to leave. The next morning, I requested a follow-up meeting with the President to discuss alternative approaches to the Logistics Coordination Challenge. Rather than accepting or declining the position outright, I wanted to explore whether there were ways to achieve the operational objectives without requiring a single individual to assume such overwhelming personal responsibility. Mr. President, I said during our second meeting, I've been thinking about the Logistics Coordination Challenge, and I believe there might be more effective approaches than concentrating all authority in a single position. What if we created a Logistics Coordination Council that includes representatives from each allied nation, supported by the predictive systems we've developed? The proposal involved establishing a multinational logistics command center that could coordinate supply operations across the entire alliance while distributing decision-making authority among experienced professionals from different nations. The approach would be more resilient than relying on a single coordinator, and it would also strengthen allied cooperation by giving each partner nation a direct voice in logistics decisions. The president and his advisors spent 2 hours reviewing the alternative proposal, consulting with military leaders and intelligence officials to evaluate its feasibility. The discussion was sophisticated and thorough, exactly the kind of strategic planning that I had always believed was possible when intelligent people focused on solving problems rather than advancing personal agendas. Colonel Mitchell, the president, said finally, "Your alternative proposal is innovative and strategically sound, but it would require someone with your expertise to design and implement the coordination systems. Would you be willing to serve as the founding director of this multinational logistics command, with the understanding that you would transition to an advisory role once the systems were operational?" The modified offer was exactly what I had been hoping for: the opportunity to contribute to solving a critical national security challenge without surrendering my long-term personal autonomy. The position would be demanding and high pressure, but it would also be time-limited and focused on building sustainable systems rather than managing ongoing crises. "Mr. President," I said, "I would be honored to serve in that capacity." The next 6 months were the most intense period of my professional life. Working with allied representatives from 28 nations, we designed and implemented a logistics coordination system that could support rapid deployment operations on a scale that had never been attempted in peacetime. The project required integrating different military cultures, harmonizing equipment standards, and developing communication protocols that could function across language barriers and time zones. The multinational command center was established in a secure facility outside Brussels, with satellite coordination offices in Washington, London, Berlin, and Tokyo. The staff included logistics professionals from across the alliance, supported by artificial intelligence systems that could process supply chain data in real time and recommend optimal resource allocation strategies. The most challenging aspect of the project was cultural rather than technical. Military organizations from different nations had developed distinct approaches to logistics based on their unique historical experiences, geographical constraints, and operational doctrines. Creating systems that could accommodate these differences while maintaining operational efficiency required diplomatic skills that I had never imagined would be relevant to my career. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult negotiation with French and German representatives who had conflicting views about equipment standardization. Rather than trying to impose a single solution, we developed flexible protocols that allowed different approaches to coexist while maintaining interoperability at the operational level. The key insight, I explained to the president during one of our weekly briefings, is that allied cooperation doesn't require allied uniformity. We can achieve strategic coordination while respecting the tactical preferences that make each nation's forces effective. The success of the logistics coordination project exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. When intelligence reports suggested that Russian military preparations had been suspended due to the demonstrated capability of Allied rapid response systems, the president credited the logistics innovations with helping to prevent a major conflict through deterrent effect. "Colonel Mitchell," he said during our final project briefing, "your work has potentially saved thousands of lives by making military aggression appear too costly to attempt. That's the kind of strategic impact that defines careers and changes history." The recognition was gratifying, but what satisfied me most was the knowledge that we had created sustainable systems that would continue to enhance Allied security long after my direct involvement ended. The Multinational Logistics Command had become a permanent institution, staffed by professionals from across the alliance who shared a common commitment to collective defense. As I prepared to transition back to my regular Pentagon responsibilities, I reflected on how different this experience had been from my years of invisibility at Meridian. The challenge had been enormous, the pressure had been intense, and the stakes had been as high as they could possibly be. But throughout the process, I had been surrounded by colleagues who valued my expertise, superiors who trusted my judgment, and international partners who respected my contributions. It was exactly the kind of environment where I could operate at my full potential, using every aspect of my education, experience, and natural abilities to solve problems that mattered. The contrast with my former life, where I had been dismissed as worthless by someone who felt threatened by my capabilities, could not have been more stark. The woman who had been humiliated in that conference room 7 years earlier had not just survived and succeeded. She had discovered that her true potential was far greater than she had ever imagined, and she had used that potential to make a difference in the world. 10 years after that humiliating moment in the conference room, I received an invitation that brought everything full circle. Meridian Defense Solutions wanted me to deliver the keynote address at their annual leadership summit, the same company where David had once called me worthless in front of his colleagues. Standing at the podium in their gleaming headquarters, I looked out at an audience that included many faces from that devastating day. Robert Chen was there, now retired but still consulting. Janet Reeves had become CEO after Margaret Thornton stepped down. Even some of the junior managers who had witnessed my public humiliation were in attendance, now senior executives themselves. 10 years ago, I began. Someone in this very building told me I was worthless. Today, I stand before you as someone who has helped reshape global military logistics, prevented international conflicts, and created systems that protect millions of lives worldwide. The room was silent, understanding the weight of that transformation. But here's what I've learned. I was never worthless. I was simply in an environment that couldn't recognize value when it was right in front of them. The question isn't how I changed. It's how many other people are sitting in rooms like this right now, waiting for someone to see their potential. As I concluded my speech to thunderous applause, I knew my story wasn't just about personal redemption. It was about the power of recognizing that everyone has untapped potential, waiting for the right moment to shine. Sometimes the people who dismiss us reveal more about their limitations than our own. Sometimes being called worthless is just the beginning of discovering how invaluable you really are. If this story inspired you to recognize your own untapped potential, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about transformation, resilience, and the power of never giving up on yourself. Your support helps us share these important messages with people who need to hear them most.